Hello and welcome back, thespians, for another Dragon Con Theater and Performing Arts Lovers unofficial panel. This one is Beyond Shakespeare's Shadow, Unsung Heroes of the Elizabethan Stage. We'll be talking about 16th century playwrights who aren't Shakespeare. So anyway, I'm joined by these lovely panelists once again. If you all could introduce yourselves, let people know why you're here, etc. Rebecca, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so my name's Rebecca Carlson. I've been involved in theater, Atlanta theater, for years, since the early 90s. Originally worked with Theater Gale for a very long time, which is an Irish theater company that we once had in Atlanta. And, just I've always liked Shakespeare. I'm a Shakespeare fan, but I've also, liked that period of history, the Elizabethan and Tudor periods of history as well. So, kind of a subject near and dear to my heart.
For sure. How about you, Deanna?
So I'm Deanna Toxopius. I am a teacher and a high school drama theater, specialized high school drama program grad. So because of that, we got exposed to a lot of Shakespeare, and it's just become something that I follow that whole period. As Rebecca mentioned, you kind of gotta love the Tudor period, Elizabethan period. It's kind of an exciting time, but it's also a time when theater kind of, as we know it in the modern English way, sort of gets its feet. And so it's kind of fascinating to look at what it is. And as a teacher, I also want to find better ways of introducing kids to Shakespeare and to that time period. So, yeah.
How about you, Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Steph Grignola. So when I went to get my master's degree, the school I went to, King's in London, had a Shakespeare program, and they had an early modern English literature text and transmission program. And I went for the latter, thinking that it would make me more employable, not stopping to pause and think that neither of those degrees really makes anyone all that employable. So we did a lot of obviously Shakespeare, but other Elizabethan playwrights as well. So that's kind of what I'm coming into this with. A lot of great experiences there. I did get to hold one of Ben Jonson's books, a book that he had in his library that he had taken notes in. Also of note, I got to hold the law book that Henry VIII took legal notes in to get his first divorce, but it's less relevant to this conversation.
Wow.
It was a very cool program.
So cool. Wow.
that is cool. Okay.
It's very relevant to this program because we're talking about Elizabethan playwrights, and
you're right.
Had he not gone and done that. I mean, there are repercussions, but I think it's very relevant. That's cool. When you said you got to hold Ben Jonson, my brain went skull, but no.
No, that would be. I would never shut up about that. You would all know that already, even if you didn't know me, because I would never. It would be my little StreamYard thing. Stephanie held Ben Jonson's skull.
Amazing.
All right. Well, that being said, I'm gonna start this off. Who is your favorite playwright of the Elizabethan era that is not Shakespeare? And can you discuss some lesser known aspect of the career of this playwright? Deanna, I'm going to pick on you first.
Okay, so I called dibs on her in the chat, and I want to talk about Lady Lumley. And some people might argue that she's not really a playwright because she's a translator. So this is Jane Lumley. Joanna would be another actress, but Jane Lumley, who was of noble birth, and she was very well educated. She's also, by the way, was a cousin of Lady Jane Grey. So if you place yourself in where we are in history. But she was very well educated and lucked out in that she married a man who was also well educated and encouraged her to continue in her scholarly pursuits. He was a book collector, and so she had access to a vast library, and where she gains notoriety is she translates a lot of Greek into English. Most significantly, the work of Euripides, specifically Iphigenia, and that becomes the basis of many pieces of follow-ups, so operas, other plays. She basically brings a bunch of Euripides works and some other orators and dramatists' work into English. And to me, she kind of encapsulates what this period was. It's the Renaissance, and you have medieval Europe rediscovering the works of Latin and of Greek that had been quote unquote lost. Were they really lost? That's a debate that historians like to have on a fairly regular basis. But she basically puts it into what we would call the Vulgate, right? So English is not the language of scholars, but she takes it out of the language of scholars, English, which makes it more accessible to people like Shakespeare. And I also would argue that a translator isn't just not a computer program. If you've ever used a computer translator, AI is making it better every day, they still don't get the subtlety of the language and understand the original and the translation. Doesn't work. She, in addition to translating this work, finesses it and makes it work. So she's and she also then becomes the first woman to translate Greek into English that we know of. There are possibly others that have been lost to history and time, but she's sort of that person. And complete disclosure, it's her wealth and her privilege that allow her this peace. So we don't get stories like we get of Shakespeare in the Elizabethan times of plucky women rising up from lower middle class or working class backgrounds and becoming well-known actors and writers. She's a woman of privilege and therefore was educated and could do this and had a life of leisure that allows her to do this. But to me, she's an interesting character that you don't get to learn about in school. And I think does a lot, because you're told when you study this period of theater that women weren't involved. It was a man's world. Boys played the women's parts, men played the men's parts, and women, if you acted, were considered prostitutes. And in fact, you just weren't doing it, right? And that's sort of a tradition that carries forward into, the Edwardian era and that kind of thing. As it goes forward and you start to get actual actresses, they're treated like prostitutes. But here you have a woman translating theater and creating a written work that is then inspired later authors. So that's who I want to bring forward, Lady Lumley.
Definitely. And how about you, Stephanie?
Well, I was going to start in with a whole thing about Amelia Bassano as a non-Shakespeare writer of the time. But Deanna did a much better job of women in theater or theater adjacent, at least at the time. So I'm just going to let that pass. So I really struggled with this. I didn't want to choose Marlowe because I kind of thought like that would be a popular choice, and there's a lot of Marlowe that we can talk about. Yeah, okay, great. So I wanted to talk about Thomas Middleton because Middleton wrote a couple of my, in conjunction with other playwrights. Middleton has a couple of my favorite pieces. So Middleton and Rowley wrote The Changeling, which I'm going to talk about for one of our other questions. Middleton and Dekker did The Roaring Girl. I think that Middleton's a good collaborator, and we don't see a lot of that. We see a lot of hidden collaboration in this time, but we don't typically get proud collaboration. I think that's something that Middleton's really good at and something that I appreciate and that I think lends a really round aspect to his plays. I think they're better because of it. And I think that that's a commendable skill in a time that's kind of a dog eat dog environment.
Definitely. How about you, Rebecca?
All right, so I will definitely call dibs on Marlowe. So, obviously I think outside of Shakespeare, he's probably the one that everybody knows best, or everybody has heard of, or they think they know best. And the more that you kind of dig into Christopher Marlowe's life, and you start to really wonder who he actually is, because he did seem to lead quite a bit of a double life. There was a lot of, is he or isn't he anything around, whether or not he was working with Walsingham, as who was the spy master for Queen Elizabeth and later James I. He did have at least a couple of jobs that seemed like they were, related to espionage. Most notably, one of the, I think it was James I's cousin and Mary Queen of Scots' cousin, Arabella. He was her tutor for a period of time, we think. Like, it's a little vague on the reference. And somewhere towards the end of that period, he was arrested for other activities that may or may not have been also related to another espionage campaign that was going on. He was arrested at one point for kind of a Catholic plot for counterfeit coins, which may have been legitimate, or it may have been the problem with Walsingham had his hands in everything, and it sounds like he had a lot of people that were working for him, so you're never really sure just how far out that spider web went. But it wasn't just the spying and the espionage. There was some question on whether or not he was, truly a devout Catholic or a Catholic at all, or if he was an atheist, which in that time is pretty much, asking for charges of heresy. And it did seem in some of his writings that he did promote atheism. You know what I'm talking about. Words, they're not working today. So it's, and of course the other thing is, it's hard to put a modern interpretation on it, but there were charges on whether or not he was homosexual. And he again, I mean, it doesn't translate to modern thought now, or how we look at it now. But again, in a lot of his writings, it did seem that he supported ideas of, homosexual ideas. He had a very different view of Edward II and in his story with Piers Gaveston. That was his last name.
I was going to say, yeah. I was coming up with Morgan, and that's not right. But yeah, Gaveston. Right, Gaveston.
It's on the first word. Yeah. Sounds like. And so I think it's, and of course there was a supposed friendship with Shakespeare. Did he or did he not, collaborate with him on some of Shakespeare's works? And he may have. There are definite, influences in Shakespeare's work that obviously came from Marlowe. And even his death is a little suspicious. I mean, everybody kind of goes on about, well, it's, it was due to a bill that wasn't settled properly. And, these three kind of got into a tiff over it. And two of those three were known, again, going back to the espionage, they were known spies and known to be rather cool liars as well. I mean, it was like, at least one of them had the reputation of, if you shake his hand, count your rings afterwards.
Have any of y'all read A Tip for the Hangman?
No, I haven't.
It's a really fun, it's, a fictionalized version of Marlowe's spy journey and it's really, I don't actually know who wrote it. It is written by Allison Epstein.
Okay.
And it's just a really fun, fast. I read it in an afternoon. It's
sweet. I'll look that up.
It's good, especially if you want to dive down that spy rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think that's really gets really interesting, and of course to tie into like just Elizabethan times in general. You know, you had Walsingham, Lord Burleigh, his son Robert Cecil. You had all of these spy rings going on, and spying and counter spying and back and forth. You know, it's just there are no good answers. Everything is a little vague. Everything is a little, you know, suspect. But you can spend some time just going deep into that one aspect of Marlowe and Elizabethan history aside.
Yeah. No, Deborah Harkness, also her All Souls trilogy, which is the it's witches, witchcraft, stuff like that. But
yeah, I know that
Christopher Marlowe plays a big role in that, and the School of Night, and especially that second book. And so he is a really fascinating character in history. I would definitely say he's probably the most well known that isn't Shakespeare.
Well, when you get into also the conversations around Marlowe and did he actually write like Shakespeare's plays, because there's always those theorists that come out and say that Shakespeare couldn't have written what he wrote because of his background, blah, blah, blah. And then they start going looking for people who could have written it, and Marlowe's name always is that one that comes up very, very quickly. There's several others if you really want to dive down that rabbit hole, but it's not, I don't want to go there. We did it in high school, and we were like, what?
We could do a different panel on who was Shakespeare.
Marlowe was also a roommate with Thomas Kydds. So again, as historians look for inferencing, roommate has been a pseudonym that many historians have used for other things. And so then, are you a roommate? Are you lovers? What is going on? But that the fact that Kydd was also tortured into revealing information about Marlowe, right? Like that. So there's that whole thing going on. Like it's like, guys, this is juicy. This is the stuff we should be telling the high school kids. This is way more interesting than stuff about Elizabethan. Like, no, guys, this stuff is.
I know.
Really
Pay attention. Like this is how you get kids and just people in general interested in history. Is they're like, oh no, trust me, this stuff gets crazy. Hang on, it's a wild story.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, even in Marlowe's like early years in what was university, he would drop out periodically. And with no record, no idea what he was doing, and then just reappear, and far beyond what university regulations would have allowed. And then he'd come back and just resume whatever his classes were that he was taking, or whatever instruction he was doing, like nothing had happened. But suspiciously, he would have more money than was accounted for in like student accounts. Like, that doesn't sound suspicious at all. Of course not. But,
definitely. Well,
what are you up to?
Now that we're talking about history and getting people interested in history, what is a common misconception about the theatrical era that we're talking about? And Stephanie, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I feel like maybe to this audience, this isn't something that like the audience of watching this is gonna, it's something that they probably already know. But I always like to start when I'm teaching with the fact that Elizabethan theater was not a highbrow place to be. Elizabethan theater was the reality television of its time. Everyone was yelling. If you're watching Love is Blind and you're screaming at the TV, this isn't real life. How is this happening? That's exactly what was happening in an Elizabethan theater. And really the Victorians are the ones who made it into something that it was never intended to be. And so stripping that pretension away from the text allows you to actually engage with it in a meaningful and relevant and historically more accurate way. Just
So
have
maybe
a little
more
fun
like
and yell a
a
lot.
Rocky Horror shadow
Exactly.
cast than high society. Yeah.
I always equated it to like it's more like WWE wrestling. Like it's really kind of in that vein. If you think about like certainly some plays like Titus Andronicus, like we're talking. This is not as you say. It's not highfalutin. It's not highbrow, and it again is the Vulgate, and that's something else. Like where they're doing the plays in English, they're not doing them in Latin or Greek. This is the Vulgate. It's not the language of the educated, and that's important to remember. Because the problem is that when we read this stuff now, we're reading Elizabethan English, which sounds highfalutin, and it
sounds
and
like theta.
yeah, well, but it's also frequently done with a British accent, and therefore it's culture. And
not even a British accent. There's like we call it Shakespeare voice. It's when people get on stage and all of a sudden they are talking like this, and it's not an accent. It's just like this weird voice that people feel like they need to be or not to be. Like it just say the words, bro.
If you want to know what that accent really is, Tom Hiddleston is in Thor. As Loki, the first Thor movie, he has that accent because he's coming out and doing that. And in fact, this is off topic, but if you read the back behind the scenes, Jamie Alexander, who played Lady Sif, just mentioned that none of them could do a British accent beyond Tom Hiddleston and Anthony Hopkins, because she's American and Chris Hemsworth is Australian. And so what they would do is they would go to Tom and they'd have Tom say the line, and then they would practice until they got that accent, because that's what Kenneth Branagh was going for, was that sort of Royal Shakespeare Company accent.
Of course.
So,
that's really funny. That's a cool.
Yeah,
that's fun.
Totally off topic, but that if you're looking for that accent, Tom Hiddleston in the first Thor movie is basically doing that.
Yeah, no, I'm never looking for that accent. Just to be clear, I never want it. I want it if Tom Hiddleston is doing it, but
I was going to say, he's doing it.
Anytime,
anywhere. Come on.
Especially if I could see him doing it as well. Like, let's be honest here.
I would argue, if you really want to see Shakespeare the way it was performed, one of the best ways I've ever seen, and to be fair, I've never seen it live, but I've seen it recorded, is the New York Shakespeare in the Parks. If you can get your hands on the documentary where Raul Julia and Meryl Streep did
Taming of the Shrew.
Thank you, Taming of the Shrew. It's like my favorite Shakespeare play, and my brain just shut
again.
down.
I'll watch Raul Julia do anything. Raul Julia, Tom Hiddleston.
Like the interaction with the audience, where like she spits in his face, and the whole audience goes, and he basically turns to the audience and does this, basically like, wait, I'm going to do something. That's much more like what Elizabethan theater would have been like than what we see now of getting herded into a dark theater and everybody's and listening and watching great performances, right? Like that was much more reminiscent of what Elizabethan theater was.
There was a lot more give and take between the audience and the actors. I think the other thing is it was not as solidified as we think of today. Now we think everything is written out, it's in a script, the script does not change. Well, back then, no. I mean, first of all, how many of these people were highly literate to begin with? Probably quite a few were not. So nothing was written down to a huge extent. And you worked in especially in supporting characters, a lot of them were kind of stock characters. Like, I'm going to play, I'm going to pick on Shakespeare, I'm going to pick on like the nurse. But you play the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. Well, that's kind of a stock character. And then you're probably going to use that character, that type is going to pop up in other shows.
Character actors existed even then. I mean, like it is, like there's a reason why we have that term. But it's also that's pulling from the classical Greek theater, because within the classical Greek theater there were stock characters that showed up in pretty much every single type of a certain type of play. In your dramas, in your comedies, there were stock characters, and so that's pulling on that tradition as well.
Definitely.
But I think the best description I've heard people talking about, how we think of theater now versus how it was then. You know, Shakespeare was not pretentious. People who like Shakespeare are pretentious. But, I mean,
I don't know about that, but
I've known a few that I'm like, well, you know, dude, come on, this is not. I think comparing it to WWE wrestling is actually a lot more accurate than you.
Well, because there's a script. There's a think
Yeah.
about it. There's a script in WWE,
Mhm.
but a lot of the lines are improvised.
It's
And-
improv. It's quick.
And it's also based and characters evolve based on audience reaction. And you can talk we're not supposed to be talking about Shakespeare, but you know, Falstaff gets to come back because Elizabeth likes him so much, right? Like, you know, I want him back. Okay, I guess he's not dead, right? No.
It's funny how much Shakespeare comes up in a panel that isn't about
It's about Shakespeare,
right?
but yeah.
No, but it's funny because actually, Joe Crow, one of the Classic Strikes directors, I had a conversation with him this last Dragon Con about. Well, I mean, if you really want, we could do a wrestling panel. I mean, that's performance
That's
right
theater.
there.
Yeah. And he'd be a very good person to get. He'd be very good. He's announcing.
So can you highlight a specific play or work written by an unsung playwright that has had some significant impact on you, or even during the Elizabethan era itself?
Yep, sorry.
I can start. It's actually not a work of theater. It's a pamphlet. And I'm going to talk about Green's pamphlet. Now, if you don't know who Robert Greene is, he was a dramatist. He wrote plays. But what we know him more now for, and this to me, I think it illustrates what this period was like, is he also would write pamphlets, which were a way of distributing ideas. Think of them as the magazines or the tweets or the internet texts of the day. And he wrote one called Green's Groat's Worth of Wit. It's got more title to it, but let's just stop there. And in it, he pretty much attacks Shakespeare. He doesn't name Shakespeare by name, but I think he's called it like Shakes something. And it's where actually Upstart Crow comes from. He calls him an Upstart Crow. And his biggest objection to Shakespeare, and I love this, is that Shakespeare is an actor who thinks he can write. And why do I love that? Why do I think that has an impact on me? Is that it shows that we have not changed that much. The shade of that is insane, and there are again also allegations he didn't write all of it. Somebody else wrote it after he died. Blah blah blah. But to me, it also gets this dichotomy of what we're getting, where some of these playwrights, like Lady Lumley, like Robert Greene, were educated. Were very educated. Like they went to university. Marlowe went to university. And then you get your Shakespeares, and to a lesser extent, I think Kidd, who didn't go to university, who just existed, right? And they may have had some education. They went to a grammar school, but they didn't get so they knew their letters, but they kind of grew up in the theater or moved up through the ranks. And it's very indication of that one group looked down on the other group. And that there was a ranking with the Elizabethan Theater Society. So I love that pamphlet. I love we get the Upstart Crow from that. So it does have an influence on theater and theater history, but it's also just the shade he throws at calling Shakespeare an actor who thinks he can write. Delicious. It's delicious.
Sorry about the crash. If you guys heard that was a cat. All right, Stephanie, how about you? I know you said you had some stuff to add on this one.
Yeah, so again, I was gonna just be a troll and talk about how the Globes, was it 2011, Dr. Faustus starring Arthur Darvill changed my life, but I'll give a real answer as well. I think that Faustus is one of the best Elizabethan plays, hands down, including Shakespeare. So that's definitely one that stands out. But I saw a production of, when I was in grad school, I saw a production of The Changeling that, for lack of a better word, changed the way that I viewed Elizabethan theater. And part of that is because I all I had really experienced was Shakespeare, and I didn't realize how tame Shakespeare and palatable Shakespeare was until I started reading some other Jacobean and Elizabethan playwrights. Like The Changeling is vile, and it's hard to watch. And I left that show like upset, and I loved it. That's what I want from theater. I want it to make me feel weird and gross and bad, and like, can I just go back and change it? And it was a really, really incredible production, so like that obviously helped. But it's the same, it's all the same characters as we're talking about those Elizabethan tropes. It's all the same stock types of characters, but they're just a little darker, a little meaner, and a little grittier, and everything's a little bit more violent and a little bit more uncomfortable. And I think as I started going into other Elizabethan playwrights, I saw a lot more of that, whereas in Shakespeare, a lot of it has been. And I don't know if that's because things change, or like in modern editions things have been toned down. Like we have the folios, but even to go to print, how much of that has changed. Like it really like spurred me into like, what else is gross and weird that I'm missing?
Definitely. How about you, Rebecca?
Well, I'm gonna go with Dr. Faustus as well, because it's, again, what you said, what Stephanie says, it's a very kind of dark, very gritty. It's like the first one that really dramatizes the story of Faust, and it's the deal with the devil. But I think the thing that I found most interesting about it was the play that we knew, or the play that we know now. Again, it wasn't solidified or written down fully until after Marlowe's death. So, it went through significant revisions, and then even after his death, it went through revisions as people picked and choose what would be allowed because of religious themes. And it would go through, I think a lot of people forget, or they don't maybe realize the extent that, you had a government that would come in and rewrite a lot of these plays based on, heresy, or this goes against the prevailing religious sentiments at the time, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, or, we won't even get into Cromwell, and his taking a hatchet to everything. And it's such a weird kind of play in the fact that it's hard to fully attribute it to Marlowe, because it has a lot of Marlowe's writing and sensibilities in it, but then it's also kind of, it has some attributes that you can't really assign to anybody. Like, who else had a hand in this show? It's just as much of a mystery when you get down to it as the rest of Marlowe's life. But it's a story that gets told and retold and retold again in so many different ways that it lives on. And it's, I'm pretty sure I would probably make a deal with the devil as well to save my books. I could see it. I get it. On a level, I do get that, yeah.
And if you haven't seen Dr. Faustus, and if you, for some reason, there's tons of versions of it, but if you haven't seen Dr. Faustus, well, in comparison to the other people we're talking about, go read it. Go read Dr. Faustus, because it is an amazing play. And to think that it was like his dream, like he constantly was working on it, constantly was meddling with it. And you can kind of, I'm not a scholar by any means, but you can kind of almost see how his life, or what was going on in history, almost kind of like made it what it is. And so by all means, if you haven't read Dr. Faustus, go read Dr. Faustus.
It's really worth it, or see it.
Well, there's
somebody who's staging it in any variation.
You can go read Romeo and Juliet anytime, but Dr. Faustus is where it's at, or the Fairy Queen.
I would also argue we live in a wonderful time in that there are many of these adaptations are available for streaming. If you have one of the British streaming services like Acorn or BritBox, they have a lot of these things coming out of the Royal Shakespeare Company, or they were filmed for the BBC years ago. So you might find, your Doctor Who actor, your, guy who was in a background shot in Marvel will be there, or your Coronation Street person there. But you also, if you have a public library card, most public libraries now have a streaming service, and a lot of this stuff is available on what is the equivalent to the Criterion Collection, and so they have this stuff. And it's available to stream. So yeah, you can find it. We live in a wonderful time for this. If there's something you really want to watch, it exists. Yep, go to your local university theater company and see them doing this, or find your local classical theater company. They exist, and go see it. But if you're in an area where that's not allowed, then hit the streaming services, because these exist. There's a Richard Burton version of Dr. Faustus. I'm not going to say it's the best version. I'm going to say, but it is Richard Burton at the height of Richard Burton. So, that's a thing. So go find this stuff.
Definitely. Well, I'm curious, were there any specific societal or cultural influences that shaped the work of these playwrights?
Have you read
Sorry,
the Decameron?
Something was flashing on my screen, and I was confused.
Have you read the Decameron? Because when I was in university and I was first exposed to the Decameron, I went, "Wait a minute, that's Shakespeare," and that you just literally flip through this book of what are essentially a collection of short stories, and there's so many Elizabethan plays in this book.
Yeah,
it's insane. You're like, what? And and I didn't do an extensive dive, but it was just. They stole from each other so much. They stole from earlier forms of literature, so the classics that were being reformed, but they also just stole from each other.
So plagiarism all around is what you're saying.
It was what's copyright? We don't have that. That did not exist. And the ones that we remember are the best versions, or the ones that were the most popular, or the ones that had the best friends who copied out your plays.
I was about to say, don't
because
whatever was allowed for, the Chamberlain and all that too. So
well, you've got somebody like Thomas Dekker, who produced over 200 plays in his lifetime, but only 20 of them have left. He has apparently produced a play a month. But part of that would maybe why we get all those stock characters showing up again, but they're stealing from each other. They go see each other's plays and they steal bits and pieces, or they think I could do a better version of that, and off they go, and they just write a better version of it, or write a version for their group. Right.
We've seen that, we still see that, right? How many more Christmas carols do we need? How many more Willy Wonkas do we need, right? How many times do we think that we can recreate?
Well, and sometimes it works,
True,
right?
Though.
It's how many things are in the public domain that don't have copyright on them that we can then steal and rewrite?
How many musicals of The Great Gatsby are currently running previews right now? I think it's at least 2. It might be 3.
And I'm going to say sometimes it works, because Wicked comes out of The Wizard of Oz, right? And Wicked is a very good reimaging, and that comes out of the book. What's his face's book, right? And that whole series, which is really brilliant reimaging of that whole story and a twisting of it. But they stole from each other all the time.
It's the Disney-fied version of his book.
It's Matilda the book, then Matilda the movie, then Matilda the musical, then Matilda the movie musical.
Yeah,
and we did a panel on Matilda, that very subject, at Dragon Con this year, about from book to screen to stage and back to screen.
Look at movies from Mean Girls, Back to the Future, They all have, let's make popular shows out of them.
Mhm.
Obviously, Disney started it with Lion King, Little
Hamlet.
Mermaid. I'm sorry, Hamlet. Well, yeah, Lion
Yeah,
King.
or my anime
Back to
friends will tell me
Shakespeare.
it's Simba
Back
the
to
White Lion.
Shakespeare. Everything goes back to Shakespeare. Who stole Hamlet from somebody else as
Yeah,
well?
who stole Hamlet? And the other thing is that the other influence on all of these playwrights is who were their patrons, who were they writing for,
Mhm.
right? And I referenced it with Falstaff coming back from the dead, but there were a lot of plays written at this time to favor the rulers, right?
Mhm.
So to favor Elizabeth and to sort of build up her reign and her place on the throne, or to at least
Or
to keep
make
her
fun of
happy.
her.
Yeah, propaganda was a huge
Yeah.
thing.
But also, like, these guys were getting themselves, to play at the Queen's court. Was considered to be quite a catch, and so they were writing plays that would get them there because it was good money, and they
Mhm.
could. It's also something they could, we played for the Queen. Woo, let's go see the play the Queen saw. Right? It's the same kind of thing. Like, it's a reason why companies compete for the royal brand in England, because it gives them cachet, it gives them weight. So that's the other thing we have to think about, is who was paying the bills. And in many cases, some of these playwrights, not all, but some, had patrons who were wealthy, and they were writing plays to add either propaganda or to cater to flatter them,
Mhm.
right? And that's where some of these plays, not everything they wrote was great. Some was garbage, but that's where this comes from.
So the political aspect of that, I know you were talking about some of them were made to hype up Elizabeth. So were politics part of the reason why a play would succeed or fail at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Because you write the wrong thing and you anger somebody up there, and they could easily shut you down. Or one person has a higher ranking patron than another, and then your show's shut down while their show flourishes.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a lot more cutthroat maybe than we look at it now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So wasn't Ben Jonson arrested for co-writing a play, which made fun of James I? And so yes, politics.
Mhm.
If you wrote the wrong thing, you would get arrested. You could, So yeah, like, it did affect you. So yeah.
I think the one cultural influence that everyone could agree on is that Italians were either fools or promiscuous fools.
Oh,
Everyone could
Oh,
agree
God.
on that.
So
The
funny.
writers, the
Mhm.
audiences, we
yeah.
all can agree that those Italians, man.
But isn't that interesting? Because who were, financial rivals of England at the time were the
Right.
Italian
course.
princes, right?
Of course.
And you'd
Mhm.
think it would be the Spanish, but the Spanish were starting to wane in their strength
Right.
and popularity compared to the rise of the Italian princes, right? So
Right.
isn't
No, I
that
mean it as an Italian, as a joke, and also as 100% serious.
But-
Like that is
but now,
absolutely
who do
why
the Brits make fun of now? They make fun of the Americans and the French,
the French,
right? Like, so,
Well,
like,
Brits have always made fun of the French. I mean, there's so much of back and forth.
but it's
I
just
mean,
like, so it's who are their rivals
yeah.
for power, right? And that's who
Mhm.
they're making fun of.
We
Maybe
have
the
a question here.
Ooh.
Speaking of patronage, does anyone have an opinion as to which playwright company would have been the hotness and been the Lord Chamberlains, the King's men had Shakespeare's company not occupied that spot?
Marlowe.
Marlo?
I honestly think it could have been a bunch of different people, because different people, again, came, like, Marlowe, yes, but Marlowe had the spy thing going on, and there are other people who came forward. So, I mean, I think,
Yeah, the Admiral's Men, though.
Yeah.
That was like the biggest company that he worked with,
yeah,
and that was probably the most well known after, you know, Shakespeare.
I just wonder if Dekker could have kept himself out of debtor's prison, if he might have done it. He's a little bit later than Shakespeare, not by much, but a little bit.
That's
Because
who
just
I was gonna say too, because he just needed that.
Yeah. He needed to keep his sheer output. Again, I am blown away by like a play a month kind of thing that he was spewing out. He's kind of like the Brandon Sanderson of the Elizabethan play writing era. Like,
and like Witch of Edmonton is one of the best Elizabethan plays, like just hands down. It's a good, fun, silly. It's got that kind of commercial or more commercial vibe that Shakespeare does. Everyone loves a play with a dog, right? So
With a dog, yeah.
Unless you don't work with children or animals, which is my feeling about plays in general. That being said, what role did personal relationships, like friendships, shape the dynamics of these Elizabethan age? Like, did they shape who would be successful and who wouldn't be? Or was it just we're all rivals and we're all out to get the same patrons, and we'll step on somebody if we get a step up? Stephanie, do you have a thought?
yeah, I mean, I would like to think it wasn't so cutthroat as that. Looking at the amount of just natural overlap there was, like I was talking about Middleton earlier, and I actually forgot that he also is credited with some of Timon of Athens, which say what you want about it, but I really like that play to read. I don't like it to watch. I think it's a stupid play to ever try to produce, but I like it as a read. I think it's really interesting. And so like you have so much of that overlap, and with a few of these, like I want to say lesser knowns. Like Rowley and Middleton and Dekker. Like I would say you've got Marlowe, you've got Ben Jonson. Those are probably the top two under Shakespeare. But like with some of the lesser knowns, there is a lot of overlap, and they are talking to each other, and they are, like Deanna said, everyone's stealing, and how much of that is actual stealing and how much of it is like collaboration and sharing, and like we both have this script, we'll each pitch it, we'll each put it up. Like I don't know, I would like to think it wasn't quite as aggressive. Obviously there are feuds and rivalries, but London wasn't that big comparatively, so they're all in the same space. There has to have been some.
And they were also performing at the same revels, because I think what the other thing we need to think about is when these big royal revels would happen, there would be multiple theater companies playing. Like we now think of when we go see Shakespeare, that's our evening, right? But there would be several companies doing perhaps short bits of their plays, maybe not the whole play, but they would do the highlights and the soliloquy, perhaps, whatever, and they would do, or the big fight scene. And so they were all, as Stephanie said, existing in the same space. And there was also collaboration. There was outright collaboration. Dekker is one that is cited for having co-written with a whole bunch of other people. So maybe instead of the Brandon Sanderson, he's the James Patterson of the Elizabethan period. He's got a lot of co-authors. Just that. So there was collaboration. They did write together, or edit, maybe take a pass at each other's scripts. I don't know how they collaborated in that time, whether collaboration meant they were all drinking at the same time and came up with the same idea, or whether they actually sat down together and wrote together, or they did like what we would call a script doctor, right? Somebody who took a pass at your script to tighten it up a bit. I don't know, because unfortunately that stuff is lost to time, because even though that would be fascinating to us, that's not what they thought would be fascinating to us. Yeah, right?
Well, one thing, and Stephanie, you kind of provided a perfect segue into this. Were there any notable rivalries or conflicts in the more, like, both renowned and lesser renowned playwrights that we know about, or not really? Because personally, I want all the tea.
16th century tea.
Anybody or not?
Well, I mean,
really?
I mentioned Green. Green certainly had a lot of disdain for Shakespeare.
Mhm.
And that was a class thing. That was totally a class thing. That Greene had been to university and Shakespeare had not. Although universities at that time weren't exactly what we think of universities now, but that's a notable one. But Greene also went after a lot of other people. Like, he seems to have been a bit of a grumpy person. But I mean, it's just interesting. He's fascinating to me for that reason, that I'm going to write a pamphlet where I'm going to diss all these people, and then I'm going to distribute it. Maybe I'll die. Maybe I'll wait till I'm dead, but I'm gonna put it out. So yeah, I think that's fascinating. So Greene would be one, and he definitely had a beef with Shakespeare.
And I'm not sure. I think along with how things were written, I think a lot of the ideas of what they thought of each other, if they were in competition, if they were friends, friends, enemies, frenemies. A lot of that, again, I think was lost over time. Either people decided it wasn't something they wanted passed down, or it just wasn't recorded or wasn't written down. I think you have to wonder how much we've lost. I mean, we have this huge body of work from this time, but how much was not collected? How much was not? How much are we missing? And I think a lot of that personal detail is, we're so used to seeing that now. Like, we know we can look at performers and hear them beef with other performers. We don't have that kind of recorded history from back then, because it wouldn't have been recorded in any way.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, I know we segue. I'm going to segue into, we talk about how you've talked about how, like, a lot of things haven't been recorded with these. So how has the legacy of these playwrights either endured or faded in the centuries that have followed? And can you draw any connections between their works and contemporary themes? Or even issues in work of bodies today? Crickets! Yay! Do you have anything?
I mean, I guess oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. You're fine.
No, I just think that, like, there's so much of the approachability and breadth of Shakespeare that has made him so long lasting. And I think that for as much work as I do, like, I think a lot as an educator and as a director about why we produce so often those Shakespeare plays that we produce. And a lot of that comes down to, what have people historically produced, right? And, like, we have the resource to watch 17 different Romeo and Juliets, so I can think about how I want to approach Romeo and Juliet. And a lot of the, well, I'm directing Troilus and Cressida this spring, and nobody does that, partly because it's bad, but don't worry, I fixed it.
You fixed it.
I rewrote the ending. It's fine. But, like, I can't send people 6 different links of Troilus and Cressida to watch to get, like, an idea of the show. And I think that's the case with a lot of this. The Victorians, we're blaming everything on them because that's what we have to do.
And we can blame everything on the Victorians.
I have a list. I have a list.
Oh,
but
God,
like,
yeah.
They didn't latch on to these, to some of these playwrights as much as other Shakespeare plays. And so what we get in performance, we don't get the Sarah Bernhardt Faustus, right? And because we don't have that, then we don't have the silent film Faustus, and then we don't have another film Faustus, and then we don't have, and Faustus is actually probably the most popular, so it's a terrible example, but whatever. We don't have those film versions or stage versions that then we as modern educators, we recognize that these are culturally impactful works because we don't have the media perpetuating them all the way throughout our, like, the way Hamlet has his fingers through everything. We don't have that with some of these other plays. So I think that that's
Mhm.
part of why they haven't lasted in a legacy way quite as
Well,
much.
and I think a lot of that, and we're joking about it filtering through the Victorians ruined everything. But in a lot of ways, they probably did serve as a filter for some of these other playwrights because of subject matter. Um, how much of Kid was produced during the Victorian age and afterwards. Probably not a whole lot. So I think there was this kind of filtering on what do we consider worthwhile and good theater versus
I also think we have to
the bad. We don't talk about this stuff. The sex and
right.
violence. We don't talk about that.
I also think we have to look at what survived. I think that's part of it, and you can argue that what survived was what was valuable. But I also think, as a historian, sometimes what survives is what we're lucky it survives. It's just pure dumb luck it survives. And the Shakespeare's folios, the fact that his friends gathered up all of his plays and bound them and then put them out, that's a big deal because that survives, right? He was popular, but he wasn't. I think we forget he wasn't as hugely popular then as he is now, where he's an institution now. He was just a playwright, and he had some mildly popular plays and had some success, but it wasn't the institution it is now. And I think that that's part of why Shakespeare gets produced all the time, and maybe Marlowe doesn't. Because Marlowe's friends didn't gather up Marlowe's plays and stuff and sonnets and bind them and get them out. Kidd's friends didn't do that. I mean, good God, Dekker's friends, where were you? I mean, you had tons. We could have had an entire library. It could have been an Encyclopedia Britannica of Dekker. But so that, I think, we have to remember that luck plays a role in this, and I think Shakespeare got lucky. There's probably an alternate timeline where we're discussing the 16th century playwrights that aren't Dekker, right? Like that, and Dekker is the one that everybody talks about because of his output, and his friends in that alternate timeline bound it. And as you know, you're right, we're missing so many Greek plays, and so many pieces of work. We don't have a lot of the medieval Bible plays, right? Like the Bible cycles that were put on every year. We don't have those. We don't have a lot of the Victorian. Like there's so much. And if you think about what's happening to film history and how film's degrading, there's things we're losing. In television history, like a look at the streaming services wiping out whole productions for tax purposes, right? Like just
for a tax write-off.
yeah. So luck plays a role. I would argue time plays a role, because right now we have so much that we could do, and Shakespeare now has the benefit of being taught in schools. So his you can do a Romeo and Juliet, and everybody knows what you're talking about. Like you're referencing Romeo and Juliet. Everybody knows that. West Side Story. We know that's a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, but set in New York, right, among immigrant communities, and those themes which permeate a lot of Elizabethan theater, but because Shakespeare's so prominent, that's who we go back to over and over again. So yeah.
Well, and historically, we've not done well with holding on to, for lack of a better term, pop culture. And a lot of this work, goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning. This is pop culture. This is TV. This is, in some cases, here's your reality TV. This is your Survivor.
WWE, right? Like how many matches, how many Raws does everybody have memorized and is now sharing with their friends and, recreating, reenacting with an amateur group on a Friday night? Very few. if any. Right? Like,
are we gonna, how much of this is going to get shared and saved for 100 years from now when we're all meeting on some kind of Neuralink or something, who knows what, to come back and talk about pop culture in the 2000s. But there's so many things that we could say from this time period that you knew were there. Like you knew that there was some kind of pop culture music that people sang to in the pubs. There were body songs. There were body stories. There were all of these things you knew existed in the time period, but because of the subject matter, it wasn't worth saving. There's quite a bit of I think, judgment on what's even worth preserving versus, oh, this is something that, no, this isn't worth saving.
Well, and I love that you're saying is worth preserving, but I also think that they didn't think that anybody would care about it in 10 years, 15 years, 100 years. And again, we've not learned our lesson. I point at Doctor Who, right? Where the BBC purged, whole sections of the Doctor that now, if you like, that private collectors are paying stupid amounts of money and holding in their collections when they find those reels, unless the person who finds them gives it back to the BBC. Private collectors just hang on to them because I got this sweet piece
of art
here sitting in my collection, and they're bragging. It's like a Rembrandt that's been stolen. It's just a bragging rights, right? Like that's all it's for. It's a bragging rights thing. So I would say that it's not just worth preserving. They didn't even think that this would be something to preserve because somebody else is going to write another play next week. I mean, Dekker is writing another one right now. Why does it matter? So I think that's the other thing too.
Well, we are at time. So as much as this is, I am going to have everybody wrap it up. Unfortunately, we could talk about this probably for 2 hours and not be done.
Stephanie, how long have you been studying this?
That being said, if you guys could let us know where we can find you online and what you're doing, I would love it. Rebecca, why don't you start?
Well, I mean, I'm hard to find online. My day job is actually IT security, so I kind of.
So you're a spy, is what you're telling us.
I make myself scarce in a lot of ways.
The Marlowe connection makes sense now.
I'm secretly Marlowe, yes. But no, I mean, I'm around on Facebook, on Twitter, TikTok, just not terribly active, I'll be honest with you.
Definitely. How about you, Deanna?
Well, I'm also on the socials, but I'm not really on X anymore because X is really grumpy and I don't like it. I'm on Blue Sky, Dekker. But if you really like memes, I run a meme page on Facebook, RevSF Memes.
Oh, nice.
We do a lot of science fiction-y memes. It was started by the great Joe Crow, and who's been mentioned here, and most of the postings are my fault. So I curate memes there. Sometimes I even make them. So yeah, you can come there. Come to RevSF on Facebook, Revolution SF.
Definitely. And we do find you pretty often in the Facebook Dragon Con Theater Facebook group as well.
Oh yeah, I post there too. I find good stuff to post, like
yes,
the Bake Off musical, because oh my god, I need that in my life.
How are you, Stephanie?
Yeah, you can find me at P2M Pod, which is Protest Too Much podcast. That's my Shakespeare podcast where we yell about silly little matchups, best ofs, and guest and I go head to head. They bring both sides of the argument, so they surprise me with who I have to fight for. Nice. Turns out with things like Mamilius having to be the best villain in Shakespeare. So it's very fun and very silly. And that is mostly Instagram and TikTok.
Definitely.
Cool.
Well, as far as myself, you can find me, and excuse the cat, on the group labeled Above Dragon Con Theater and Performing Arts Lovers Unofficial. We are an unofficial part of Dragon Con. We are not a track, but our goal is to inspire more theater programming at Dragon Con. So if you haven't joined us already, please do so. Otherwise, our next panel, this is our last live panel for the year, but our next panel will be January 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's Places, Please, Stage Managers in the Limelight. So it holds a special place in my heart. So yeah, no, definitely check us out then, and stay tuned to the socials, because some unexpected things might be showing up and at the end of the year. So definitely stay tuned. Until then, we will see you later. Bye.
Bye.